Mike, I think.
I'm still
There we
muted.
go.
Okay. Hey, everybody. Thank you so much for watching today's episode of Legacy Owners Live. We've got an awesome show for you today. We've had a little bit of technical difficulty, so we're getting a little bit of a late start, but we're going to get there. So this is Kale Hamblin. Hi, Kale.
Hi, Mike.
How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. So what are we talking about today?
So today we are going to talk all about the donor advised funds, DAFs.
Okay.
I figured that this would be a good time to kind of just like dive into it. What are DAFs? Yeah, donor advised funds. Why would we have them? What are the purposes of them? And are they a good choice for people like for me? Should I have one? So I just kind of wanted to go over all of that stuff.
Absolutely.
Especially people are like going into the year, like the year end, like this is a good vehicle that they could use to do year end giving. So
yeah, donor advised funds are an awesome vehicle. I think everyone really should have one, especially if you are into philanthropic giving. It's a great vehicle to give out grants. We use it as a training program for our kids, and it's an excellent vehicle to teach them the impact that charities can have.
Yeah. And I know I always say this, but for somebody like me who didn't know about Legacy before I started working here, I think there's a lot of people who don't know what a donor advised fund is. And so I think it's important to kind of get the word out there about donor advised funds because they are very beneficial.
Yeah, in donor advised funds, it's kind of like the analogy I always like to use is setting up a checking account with a bank, right? And so it's setting up some kind of charitable account with an existing 501c3 where you can receive funds in and people can get tax deductions for, and then be able to make out grants just like you would, you put money into your checking account and you use it to buy things, right? And so a donor advised fund works very similarly, where you can get funds in and then also make grants out to specific charities. A lot of people use donor advised funds. It's great with estate planning, just because when you go in and set up an estate plan or a trust or things like that with your attorney, you can create beneficiaries within your estate, right? And so if I'm going to give X amount to son 1, son 2, daughter 1, daughter 2, and then the rest will go to charity, I don't know if those existing charities will exist the day I die, right? So I'll set up a donor advised fund with an existing charity so that that's ready to receive those funds to go to an existing charity. And then in my donor advised fund, I can have, I can be the donor while I'm alive, but then there can also be successor donors, successor advisors to me that oversee how those funds are used and how they're granted out to other charities. And I can choose to grant it all out all at once, or I can grant out over time. And so having that donor advised fund gives me that flexibility. And then, for example, if I want to use charity A, but charity A ends up losing their tax status, or they suffer from mission drift or something like that, I don't have to go back into my estate planning attorney's office to change my estate to pick a different charity, right? I can just pick the donor advised fund. And in that way, I know that's not going to suffer any kind of mission drift because I'd be the one doing it. So.
Yeah. So there's a lot that goes into donor advised funds, and that's kind of what we would just wanted to cover in this live, just everything that goes into it. And so basically, a donor advised fund is the least expensive, the fastest, and the easiest way for a person to establish their foundation. And
that's right.
And so, like Mike said, a donor advised fund is an account held by a public nonprofit corporation, like Legacy. So you can set up a DAF with us or Legacy. And I think Mike has one.
Yep, I have one. Yep,
with
I do
legacy?
have one. I have a couple of charitable entities, but what's really unique about what Legacy Global does is that it doesn't cost anything to start or set up a donor advised fund. Not every nonprofit is that way. Sometimes they require a minimum of 5, 10,000, 20,000 even I've seen, and so it's great just because Legacy uses it, has it set up to where it won't cost anything to set one up, just because it might be sitting there empty until some kind of event, usually either a taxable event or death of the
And
original
so,
donors.
how long can your DAF sit there without activity being used at Legacy? Does it
I haven't seen a limit.
do
I haven't seen a limit yet.
Yeah, because when I was doing research for this, it said that for some, like for Fidelity or for Schwab or other um, businesses, they have a time limit. If it's not active for like 5 years, then they'll
Mhm.
transfer the funds to like a philanthropic fund. So
Yeah,
it's
and I
nice to know
can.
that Legacy, there's no time limit for it can just sit there for
Yeah,
as long.
yeah, and I can see the reason for that. Most of the donor advised funds at Legacy are active, um, and if some of them become so active, we actually convert them into some kind of fiscal sponsorship or program fund, just because there are some things a donor advised fund cannot do that those other vehicles can do, right? So a donor advised fund, you cannot go out and run a 5K for a donor advised fund. It cannot go out and pay the expenses and the permits and all that kind of stuff. You can't do that with a donor advised fund, because a donor advised fund is just like a checking account, right? It's making out grants. It's not paying contractors and vendors and things like that to a charitable cause. And so that's what we use fiscal sponsorships or program funds for. And so, that's something to think about. And you can always take a donor advised fund and convert it, but you can't go back. You can't go from a program fund back to a donor advised fund.
Okay. Yeah, that's good
And
to know.
so a donor advised fund is a great starting point. And then as activity starts to ramp up and things start happening, and you might want to do more, you could always leave the donor advised fund where it is and then start a program fund with Legacy, um, or you can convert it if you're not going to use the donor advised fund.
So what would be the purpose of a donor advised fund? What is the purpose of it?
The purpose of it really is to be an advisor to your philanthropic giving, right? So instead of giving one big lump sum to a charity all at once, you would have a donor advice fund set up to where you could either have more options. Really, you can donate it all at once to your favorite charity, or you can make that charity earn it every year. So if I have $10,000 in my donor advice fund, I can give $1,000 to that charity for the next 10 years, and make them, show me the impact of that $1,000 every time, right? And so now I'm creating some kind of legacy rather than just one big lump sum of cash to charity. So that's one way. We use it as a training vehicle for our kids. Our kids are pretty young, and so they become junior advisors at a specific age. I've talked about this before. People are probably sick of hearing me talk about it, but at a certain age, our boys will become junior advisors to the board, to the advisory board, and they get to pick a part of where those grants will go. So Erica and my wife and I are senior advisors, and we ultimately decide where we advise the funds to go. And our kids can select either a cause or a specific charity, but then they have to go work with that charity, right? We're making out the grant, and that's all good, but we're not actually running the program like that other charity is. So we'll have our kids go work with them, volunteer a little bit and see the impact, and then come back and report how are those funds used, what kind of impact did you see, and should we donate to them again, right? And they have a say. It gives them a sense of responsibility with it, but it also makes them, see that they're also having an impact, right? And so that's just how we use our donor advice fund.
I love that. And how often do you talk about the donor advised fund, your donor advised fund, and like giving to charities? How often do you talk about that as a family?
Um, we have our weekly family home evenings. We usually talk about needs within the family for those, but as far as the donor advice fund, we are actively volunteering with other organizations, and so that's always just kind of something that comes up just out of the blue. It comes up weekly, it comes up monthly. With the donor advice fund specifically, we give to it monthly, and then we either will grant it out as soon as we can, or we'll wait till the end of the year when we're wanting to do maybe a toy drive or fund a charity that's doing a toy drive for a cause that we care about. But we usually talk about that towards the Thanksgiving timeframe, because then we'll make out a grant before the end of the year. But what's great about that is we can donate to the donor advice fund all year long, and then at the end of the year, we can say, okay, we have X amount in the donor advice fund. How much do we want to grant out this year? How much do we think will make a good impact on somebody? And then we involve our family with that, usually at like a family dinner or something like that. Usually not really something official, because our kids are still pretty little, but
Mm-hmm.
but it's something that we're at the dinner table eating food or ice cream or chocolate milk or something, eggnog. So
Yeah, I love that. I love that your kids are talking about that at such a young age, and that's
yeah,
something
it's good.
that brings your family together.
Yeah, and my one of my sons is extremely social. He runs his own podcast and he comes up with topics and everything, but then we go out to activities and he just talks to everybody about everything, right? And
Yeah.
he is sometimes it can be a little awkward for me because I'm not always that way, but he is, and he has like no fear. But then he'll talk about what we do as a family for the charity, and it's something that he's
So
obviously very
cool.
proud of. So it's also good just because we have requirements for them to they have to, instead of earning a an allowance, they earn a commission off the hard work that they do. They have to mow the lawn, and they get paid for that, and so they're kind of running a business in a sense. They have to learn how that business runs, but it's not just about making money, right? It's about how are we impacting our community, and what is our family's involvement in the community to make it a better place. We have a specific role to play, and that's kind of the mentality we come at it with is, hey, we're here in this neighborhood. How are we going to make it better, right? And how do we make everything that we're involved in better? I think
I
that's a good
love that.
mentality to have.
It is a really good mentality to have.
Mhm.
Um, I, like I said, I didn't know anything about donor advised funds before I came to Legacy. So learning about all of this is really beneficial for me, and even gives me the opportunity to set personal charitable goals that I want to have.
Mhm.
But I love that that's what a donor advised fund does. It can help you align your charitable goals and your mission, and keep you accountable
Absolutely.
to doing that every year or every month, or how, like you said, you can do it as often as you would like to. But it's just that good. It's a good vehicle to have to keep you in the giving spirit. And I love
hmm
that it's such a good thing to have as a family too, to talk
hmm
about. And
and there's so many people that don't have families, kids or
right,
whatever, but it's also important to have a charitable mission for yourself. I have my own
right.
charitable mission along with my family. I volunteer by mentoring kids in foster care, and I mentor one kid at a time, but that's my own charitable thing. But it's something that my family has to support me in, so that involves our family charitable plan. But it doesn't mean that you have to necessarily have to, have a whole family to be involved. You could be, your donor advice fund could have a single advisor, which would be you. So that's just something to think about also, and how you're going to be leaving that legacy, even without, kids or a spouse or something like that too.
Yeah, I love that. So we've kind of already touched on it, but the advantages and the disadvantages of a donor advised fund. I just kind of wanted to run through the advantages. It's like we kind of
hmm
we mentioned before, creating your personal or your family charitable legacy. You can have an immediate tax deduction. I don't think we've really talked about that today,
No,
but
we haven't talked about that.
Yeah, you have that. Um, and then donors they have the opportunity to donate a wide variety of assets. And we've
Mhm.
said this before, but at Legacy, we take basically anything and everything.
Yeah.
Is there any other advantages that you would want to add to that list?
It simplifies your giving. So that just like, we touched on that a little bit, where you don't always have to go into your estate planning attorney to change your estate plan to adjust, who you're giving to and all that kind of stuff. So that's something to think about as well. So simplifying your giving could be really good. Sometimes if you give to, a lot of different organizations at once, come tax time, it can be a little difficult to make sure you're gathering all the right receipts and everything. Rather, with a donor advised fund, you can just have the end of year tax receipt that Legacy or your 501c3 gives you for the year end giving, and then just file that with your taxes, and then you're done. So it really simplifies things. Also, it keeps things nice and clean.
Very true. Very true. And then the disadvantages. We've talked about this before, but other businesses such as Schwab and Fidelity and Vanguard, they require an initial contribution. Actually,
Mhm.
Schwab and Fidelity, they don't. I looked this up, they don't, but Vanguard requires a minimum an initial contribution of $25,000 to start that.
Okay.
But at Legacy,
Yeah.
we don't have that fee. So that's good
Right.
to know.
Right. And they might, and you want to look at all those kind of rules, just because some of them might have requirements of how much do you give, or are you investing it? So there has to be some kind of activity with those funds as well. They usually just can't be sitting there. It's not wise for it to be just sitting there. If you are going to put things into your donor advice funds can also invest into, real estate or stock or things like that, where you can have that grow, and then you can grant out in perpetuity when off the returns. And so donor advice funds can do things like that. And so you want it to be kind of moving, whether it's granting out or growing the donor advice fund as well.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, they also have a disadvantage to it is they do have like the yearly fees. And that
Mhm.
the fees list can kind of grow if you're with Schwab or Fidelity. Um, they have
Yeah. It can be interesting, because sometimes they'll say zero fees, but there's really more fees on the back end that maybe you're not seeing right up front. So you just kind of want to work with your financial, advisor and your estate planning attorney to kind of see exactly what those might be and what kind of disclosures there should be. Yeah, there are some fees, with Legacy, the 1%, annual fee as far as what's sitting in the account, and then also anything that goes out. There's usually a fee for, administrative costs such as due diligence. You want to make sure that the grants that you're making out to organizations, and this is why we love working with Legacy on it, is because we want to make sure that our money is not only going to make an impact, but it's also going to the right people. There's a lot of fraud in the nonprofit space, so you have to make sure you gather all the right paperwork. Make sure that who you're giving to is actually who they are and who they say they are, and that they're doing what they say that they're doing. And so it kind of gives us that security, and that's really what we see it as, is okay, well, we're gonna give a portion of this to Legacy, who's a charity also, so it all goes to charity. But we're gonna make sure that we're giving, wisely, and we're sure about, who we're giving to, and that makes us feel really good about it.
Yeah. So in a way that's a huge advantage because
Hmm.
Legacy does all of that homework for you so that you don't have to
Yeah.
worry about, is my donation going to a legit charity or is it going towards fraud that I don't know about?
Yeah.
But here at Legacy,
Yeah.
we vet and we make sure that that's a legit charity that it's going
Yeah.
to. So that
Yeah. And donor advice funds have received some scrutiny before, also as kind of a negative thing, because some people might give to a donor advice fund and get that tax deduction right away, but there's no requirement for distribution, right? So the funds could be sitting there for a while, not doing anything, not granting out. There's really no rules. Like in a private foundation, there's a 5% requirement every year that you have to give out 5% every year. But white papers by PhDs and research studies have shown that donor advised funds actually give closer to 19-20% every year of what they bring in. So they actually give a lot more without the requirement, rather than having a requirement and imposing that. Then people usually just give what's needed. But a lot of people, would give to a donor advised fund like we do, where we may get the tax deduction right away, but we're usually using it within the year. But they might want to save up 10 years, giving and giving and giving, getting the tax deduction while we need it now. But then when our kids are older and they have more serious, charitable causes that they want to give to, they might want to give more. But we've saved up all this money in the donor advice fund over time, and now we're granting out, and now it's making an impact. And so having those requirements can kind of also, hamper or damage charitable giving, just because we want to give more and we want to see a bigger impact. More people are willing to give more money because they want to see the sizable impact. But if you're only given, nickels and dimes every now and then, you may not see a big impact unless you have a lot of people giving, the nickels and dimes together, right?
Right. Yeah. And it's all about your experience with donor advised funds too, because over time you'll be able, and you'll get more and more into it, like you were saying, like more and more involved with your donor advised fund, because people they genuinely love to give what they can give to people. And your donor advised fund just is a good encouragement to do so. And so I like that you said that over time it can change, because your kids will grow up and they'll say, hey, we want to donate to this charity and this one too. And just even knowing what kind of different charities there are, it's good for your kids to learn that at such a young age.
Yeah. And they call that the love rush, right? Is sometimes, here at Legacy, we get people who are giving just straightly because they want a tax deduction. And that's perfectly fine, because they're still giving to charity. It's awesome. And they're giving to awesome programs, but they end up becoming more philanthropic after, because they do get that endorphin, hit, that what they're doing is actually impacting real people, real lives, real communities. And now they want to give more. And so, a donor advised fund is a great entryway to get into that, because the more you give, the more you like it, and the more you give more. So,
yeah. So Mike, can you kind of tell us the difference between a donor advised fund and a charitable trust?
Yeah. So a donor advised fund, the main differences that you're going to see there is a donor advised fund is completely philanthropic. So when you give, you're getting 100% tax deduction on what you give, right? With a charitable trust, like a charitable lead trust or charitable remainder trust, those are what's called split interest gifts. And so you normally will only get about a third or more of a deduction when you give to that, just because that's also going to spin off income either to the donor or the charity, depending on what kind of trust it is. And so they're a lot more complicated. There is a lot more setup costs with the charitable trusts than there are with donor advised funds. But they usually can go for like a term of years for the charitable trusts, or they can go for your lifetime. But those typically would also have to be funded right away also. Whereas donor advised fund doesn't have to be funded right away.
Is there a limit for the funding the CRT?
There's no limit. No. And normally people are, in my experience with charitable trust, they're usually giving a non-cash asset, just because 90% of what's given to charity is non-cash. So it could be real estate or business interest or cryptocurrency. We've talked about that in the previous episodes on this show, but they're usually giving some kind of non-cash asset. And then once it goes into the charitable trust, it liquidates, and then we invest those funds, or we can make out. Usually you're not granting out right away. You're usually wanting to have those assets and those investments grow over time to produce income. And then, at death, usually there's a big event where it either goes as a remainder trust, it goes to charity, or if it's a lead trust, it goes back to the beneficiaries. So it just kind of depends. But a donor advised fund is a lot more simple and less complicated. There's a lot less paperwork with a donor advised fund.
Yeah, and we're gonna go over charitable trust next week. Hi, Kevin. On our live next week, so we'll kind of talk more about all that stuff.
Yeah, excellent. Well, good.
Um,
Was any other questions so far?
yeah, I just have just like a couple more. So we already said that how much money do we need to open a DAF? We do not, for legacy, you do not need any money to open a DAF. It's free
Right.
with legacy.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
that's good to know. Um, I wanted to kind of talk about um, what I'm just going to go over really quick what donor advised funds support. They
Okay.
can support public charities, religious organizations, educational institutions, philanthropic programs and initiatives, and other qualifying nonprofits and charitable causes. So there's there's a lot that you can do with your donor advised fund, and it's kind of what we've been talking about. Um, but just the last question is a DAF, is a donor advised fund a good fit for me? And so I just
That's
think that if you have that charitable mission or that goal that you want to fulfill, I think it'd be a really good idea to have a donor advised fund. And I think it'd be a good way to um, do it with your family as well, to start talking about charities and how you can donate to different causes and organizations. And so, do you have any
yeah.
other?
Well, yeah, and a donor advice fund can be called pretty much anything you want it to be, right? We have the Glover Foundation, and it sounds cool and it sounds big and all that kind of stuff, but
It is cool.
it's a donor advice fund is all it is, and we can white label it for you. And so that way, white labeling means that it has, our logo and our brand on it. We have our own website, but in the fine print, you might see that it's a donor advice fund from Legacy Global Foundation. And so it's a great way to kind of get our name out there. I've given a presentation also on how to build wealth with charitable giving as well. We can maybe one day show that on the live show as well. But you build influence. It's a great way to build influence within your community. The Glover Foundation is giving out a grant to my kid's school. It's not going to my kid directly, but it's going to the school, and they see it's coming from the Glover Foundation. And so when we go there, the principal is shaking our hand, and we're making good friends with people there, and we can see the kind of impact that that's having at the school, and that's all great. My kids can see that impact. And so it's a great way to just, build a name for yourself, or you can make it completely anonymous. And that's what's also a really great thing about the donor advice funds is if I don't want my kid's school knowing that we're the ones that are giving, this grant out to the school. That way they don't come talk to me. They don't keep asking me for money when we go to the PTA or whatever. It can be given by Legacy Global Foundation and by an anonymous donor. And so we have that option every time we make that grant because that's what our donor advice fund gives us the right to. And so we can always, and this is also important with the donor advice fund is to know is that we are advisors to the fund, right? Legacy ultimately, this is the caveat here also, Legacy ultimately has the discretion to say yay or nay on a grant, which normally they would say yay. They say yes because what we're giving to is a charitable cause and it's legal, it's ethical. If we ever wanted to give something that might be in a gray area, they would reject us and tell us how do we give to our charitable mission in the same way. Maybe it's to a lot of times when we have people wanting to give to something, we want to make sure it's not going to a private endearment where our family could benefit from the donation. We don't want that. The IRS does not like that. And so Legacy looks out for us for that, and so we're making sure that we're protected, we're okay, and that our giving is charitable giving. It's real charitable giving as it's intended to be.
I love that. I love it. And like Mike said, it's really easy to set up a donor advised fund with us at Legacy. I think you fill out a simple one-page application, which just
Hmm.
basically says, what do you want to name your donor advised fund, like Mike was saying, and who are the
Hmm.
donors and what's your mission. So it's very, very
Yep.
easy. It's free and you can get it started today. It's very easy to do
Yeah.
that. So
Yeah, so that also brings us towards the end of our show. And people can go to legacyownerslive.com, and we're going to start building a community on the Legacy Office's website, where we're going to start posting, these shows, but also have resources and things that are available to you like links to the donor advice fund, information about charitable trusts and charitable remainders and whatnot. So go to legacyownerslive.com. We'll have updates on, our schedule for the show and all the other resources that you're going to need. So just go ahead and attend and sign up for that. That's also free.
Yeah.
All right. Well, very good, Kel. Was there anything else? Any other questions?
No, that was it.
Okay. All right. I don't see any questions in any of the comments. We want to thank Kirk Moat also for being here. And then also, of course, Kevin Wade. We love them and are appreciative of them attending. So we will be live again next week, every Tuesday, 4 p.m. Arizona time. And I know the time's just changed. So we are 1 hour ahead of California and just 2 hours from the East Coast. So just be aware of that for now. But other than that, we'll go ahead and sign off for now. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.